Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, assalamu alaikum, wherever you are joining us from. My name is Katarzyna and I am a member of the MACFEST team. So welcome everyone to MACFEST 2023 and Muslim Women's Arts Festival. Today we're still celebrating the International Women's Week, and this year's theme is Embrace Equity. And we're celebrating today with the highlight of our Literary and Women's Arts Festival with an event with Fatima Manji. She is a Channel 4 broadcaster, newsreader, and an author. And she's launching currently her latest book, Hidden Heritage. Today, she will be talking about her work in the media and her new book, as well as the theme of this year, Embrace Equity, and what it means for her. So let me now introduce our host, Simon Guerrier, an author, producer, and the chair of Books Committee of the Writers Guild of Great Britain. His most recent novel is Sherlock Holmes, The Great War, and his most recent documentary is Disgusted, Mary Whitehouse, presented by Samira Ahmed on BBC Radio 4. Simon is currently working on a biography of David Whittaker, first story editor of Doctor Who, for the publication in 2023. And we're also proud to announce that this event is sponsored by the University of Salford. University of Salford is our excellent partner. It's been for 5 years. And it's been supporting and training our volunteers and staff members at MACFEST. So we've got fantastic guest speakers here, lovely people. So please comment and ask your questions either in the chat or in the QA portal. On behalf of MACFEST, I'd like to thank you for all the donations. They are really helping us fund all these wonderful events. Most of those events are free, so please look at Eventbrite and join us again in the future. And follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and TikTok. And please use the hashtag #SpreadHoney, So thank you very much. I hope you're going to enjoy today's event. And over to you, Simon.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Simon Guerrier, and I will shortly be speaking to Fatima about her amazing book, Hidden Heritage. Just before we begin, I thought I'd just let you know how this will work. I'm going to talk to Fatima. I've got some questions for her until about 3 o'clock, and then I'll open that up to questions. So if you can put questions in the chat, and I will work my way through those, and we'll get through as many of them as we can before 3:30. I'd now like to introduce Sam Ingleson, who's going to give us a bit of context about the University of Salford's involvement in MACFEST. Sam has worked in the School of Arts, Media and Creative Technology since 2000 as a senior lecturer in the visual arts, working in socially engaged arts practice and creative education. In her current role as Associate Dean for Enterprise and Engagement, she is responsible for the development of external relationships and partnerships with creative industries, business and third sector organisations, and the generation of new commercial income streams into the school. Sam, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, I'd just like to say on behalf of the University of Salford, we're really proud to be part of MACFEST and MACFEST Women's Festival as well. As it said in the introduction, we've been working them for a number of years with our student-led design and media agency, and Kesra is also an alumni of the university, which is great. The festival is really important to our school, as we're the School of Arts, Media and Creative Technology, which with a festival such as MACFEST that embodies all the creative arts, it's really good to see all the different sections that really sort of engage with our students. And when I was offered a choice of which session I could sponsor, it was very easy to choose this one. I'm really delighted to be here and looking forward to listening to Fatima and Simon in your conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Fatima, I've been fascinated by your book. but I'm aware that there may be people who are listening into this who haven't read it yet. So could you give us a précis of what it is and what it's about, please?
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks, Simon. Thank you for that kind introduction and saying the book is amazing. That's very kind. I'll pay you later. And thanks so much to MACFEST and the sponsor and all the organisers for bringing us together today. So Hidden Heritage is essentially a journey through Britain's stately homes, galleries and museums. It's not a comprehensive guide in any way. And it touches on elements of arts, culture, history and politics. Essentially, each chapter presents an object or a mystery around an object, which either comes from or is inspired by South Asia or West Asia. I present that object to you and give you a little bit of history around that object. And then I use the story of that object, whether it's an artwork, a painting, a sculpture, a statue, to reflect on something that's happening in our current day culture or politics. So it's a combination of sort of history, arts and politics all together.
Excellent, thank you very much. So the first chapter begins with Chiswick House in London. And there's a portrait that you begin with of an ambassador, and what you do is you tell us who that ambassador is, and he is Muhammad bin Hadu al-Attar, who arrived in Britain in 1682. So was that the portrait that you saw first that sparked this off? Where did this book come from?
No, I mean, the book is sort of structured chronologically, so it's not in the sort of sections that I found them. It starts with Tudor and Stuart Britain, and it ends at the First World War. So the structure is chronological. For me, it sort of started around 2016. Politically, it was very charged, both in the UK and beyond. You know, that was the year of Brexit and Trump. And without taking a position on those, I think we can all accept that they were incredibly politically charged moments. And for someone working in news, it sort of felt like we were having these really intense conversations around immigration and empire, what it means to be British, without the historical context. And one of the things I was doing was sort of going to art galleries and museums as an escape from work, but sometimes I'd see things that would feed into those conversations. And I really felt that actually we needed to take a look at the country's past in order to have a more informed conversation about what was going on currently and what it means to be British and what makes up the fabric of Britain. And along the way, I'd sort of come across various objects, the Moroccan ambassador's painting being one of them. Chapter 2 is about the lost mosque at Kew, but I'd sort of started like a magpie collecting these things. And then I just thought, oh, these are really interesting things that I find interesting. And then I mentioned them to friends and they'd just say, oh my God, I had no idea that existed there. Or I'd never think to step into that place. You know, I didn't think that there would be anything that would interest me in a stately home. And I thought, well, that's interesting in itself. You've got this sort of wealth of objects around the country, in smaller museums and galleries and stately homes, and maybe only certain people feel that there's something that's of interest for them there, and they go to those places. So that was also a motivation to write it. Because I wanted to bring those histories and that art and those stories to a broader audience, but also use them to tell a broader story about Britain and where we are today.
Excellent.
So I didn't answer your question, I'm sorry. I don't know which one was the exact first one.
But it seems to be that this kind of thing was percolating anyway, and then became a fixed thing. So you said 2016. When did you sort of formally pitch a book on this?
So I think it must have been 2017. I mean, I tell people it's sort of, it's kind of 5 years work in this. You know, I don't know about you, Simon, but I'm not one of these people who can just sort of wake up at 4 a.m. and just, you know, write pages and pages and go out and feed the dogs or whatever. You know, there's a glamour around writing that people imagine that it's sort of this, you know, very easy thing that just flows to people who are writers. And, you know, maybe there are some fantastic writers who can do that. I'm not one of them. You know, for me, writing is the research in itself took a long time. And I was doing that alongside my full-time job at Channel 4 News. So obviously it was on days off that I'd sort of trick myself and say, well, this is not work. When I'm going into archives or I'm going to a museum or gallery, that's not work. I'm just doing this for fun. And so, you know, I'd sort of collate things along the way. And the research is really what took a long time, because sometimes you'd come across, the Moroccan ambassador is a classic example, you'd come across a painting and at Chiswick House, and I don't know if that's still the case, I've not been there recently, but at that time there was just a very small brass plaque that just said the Moroccan ambassador. And there was this amazing, striking painting of a man on horseback with sort of slightly darker coloured skin than most of the other paintings in the building. And I just thought, well, who's the Moroccan ambassador? And I remember asking the guide, and this is not to single out that place, but in lots of places I asked the guide or tried to find information in that place, and they'd say, well, we don't actually know much about this, or they might be able to give you a year or something. And so some of the objects took longer than others to actually find out the history of them. In other examples, you know, so the lost mosque at Kew Gardens, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a second, that object doesn't exist anymore. You know, all I knew was that there was once a Turkish mosque at Kew Gardens. And I came across this sort of sentence in a book I was reading, and I thought, well, what an extraordinary thing. What mosque at Kew Gardens? And if you go there today, there's no sign of it. You know, there's no physical trace of it whatsoever. You really have to know what you're looking for to actually even find the site. So in that case, you know, it was a question of trying to find the architectural plans, etc., which I was very fortunate to do at the British Library. But you will know, Simon, these things, research takes a really, really long time. And, you know, to any aspiring writers out there, if it feels tough, you know, I've been there, and it is tough, and that's part of the process, I think, actually, because I found that in the process of doing that research, a lot of the ideas come together, and there are links between things that you don't quite understand when you start out. So, you know, so there are things that are in different periods of history where certain characters or the family of other characters prop up. So that's also quite interesting to sort of see how history is linked across the years. But yeah, so it's a number of years' work. It's not something that I've just been able to churn out quickly, I'm afraid.
And I'm interested that you thought this is a book, because as a newsreader, did you not think, oh, this is a documentary, or this is a... At what point did it become a book rather than any other kind of way of presenting information? People have asked about documentaries, and there are conversations ongoing, and people are interested in sort of turning this into a documentary. So that may come yet. But for me, I wanted something that would be longer lasting. And you know, particularly when you work in news, everything's very fleeting. You know, we say today's news is tomorrow's chip paper. We live in a world where people communicate ideas on social media, and it's all very quick and it's real time. And whether it's Twitter or TikTok, you know, we're watching it and it's sort of gone very quickly. So I wanted something that would last and would be a sort of an account of events, and something people could turn to in maybe 10, 20 years time, even if the politics may be different, but the history of those objects would still be available. And so I wanted something that would be a record, but it's still a very visual book. You know, all of the, I mean, there are some photographs and illustrations in it, but, you know, I tried to give detailed descriptions of those things. And I mean, people say that they can tell that I have a background in television because I'm always looking at the visuals in the book. So it's still a very visual book, but I mean, I'm a firm believer. You know, I collect many more books than I can read, but I'm also a firm believer that books still have something to offer us that none of the other media somehow captures, I think. Yes, I thought the thing that it's made me want to do is go and visit these places and see the things for myself. In a documentary, if I've seen them on the documentary, I'm not sure I would. So it feels more like a prompt to action than a documentary would.
Yeah, and that was part of the reasoning too. I think, you know, it's to say, let's get different audiences into these places to ask some more critical questions, and it's a call to action in the sense to say many more of us should be able to own British history and find our part in it, and to be able to speak about it with knowledge and authority. And currently, and it's changing, but currently there's still only a narrow set of people who feel that they can do that. So
there's quite a mix of places that you've been to, and often your investigations will lead you to other things as well. But I'm interested in how you chose where to go, because there's a couple of times where you mention artifacts or things that have been built that are in private hands.
Mm.
For example, there's a I don't want to spoil the chapter, but so one thing that you talk about is in the house of Prince Edward, who's now this week the Duke of Edinburgh. So I wonder, did you sort of request to go and see it, or did you think that's in private hands, so I won't go and see it, that's outside the scope of this book? How do those decisions get made?
I mean, I largely I wanted all of the places to be accessible to other people. So most of what I talk about is available for people to go and see in a museum or gallery. There were instances where I'd ended up in conversation with a curator or a guide, and then they showed me something in storage, or they gave me access to something that you wouldn't necessarily have as a member of the visiting public. But in general, most of my visits took place in a very a sort of low-key way. You know, I'd go as any other visitor, because I also wanted to see what sort of experience people were being offered and what they were being told or not told. And that was quite important. That is quite important to the story, because there's so much about, you know, what are we not telling people? What are we focusing on? And what do we leave out? What's the hidden part of this? And I think you can only do that if you go in as a general visitor, rather than going in saying, hello, I'm writing a book, or hello, I'm a journalist, because people automatically treat you differently. On the point about the thing in private collections, I mean, there were instances where I thought it would be interesting to see them, or to be able to get some sort of form of access to them. So there were instances where that you know, that process took place. I mean, but there was a slight difference. I mean, for example, at the British Library, I was able to gain access to certain manuscripts where you do need a written letter to say you're doing some form of research. So those aren't as easily accessible to the public. For example, the letters that Queen Elizabeth I exchanged with the Ottoman Empire and Sultana Sofia, who was the wife of the Ottoman Sultan. They exchanged letters, and those letters are still available at the British Library. They're not on display for public consumption generally, unless there's a special exhibition, and you can understand why, because they're incredibly fragile. So I was fortunate enough to go and see those, and I give a detailed description of those, because I understand that many people won't be able to do that. But in the case of the sort of Prince Edward example that you gave, I did actually ask to include a photograph of that in the book, and they turned that down. So, you know, I'm holding my grudge against him, I'm afraid.
The visits to archives and things, I mean, your book was published in 2021, and so I wonder whether lockdown and things affected what the writing of it and what you could have access to. Did that steer what you were writing about? So
actually, I was very fortunate in that by the time we got to 2020 in lockdown, a lot of the core research had been done. It was a question of following up and fact checking, and actually writing whole sections based on research that had already been done. So my process was, I did a sort of overall arc of research for the book, and then I'd do extensive research for each chapter, and then write up that chapter, and then go back to it and cross-check with other chapters. So by the time I got to 2020 in lockdown, which I think, you know, if I was starting to try and go to sites at that point, it would have been impossible. So I was very lucky, because I had very detailed notes from all of the sites that I'd already been to. And I think by the time of lockdown, every site that I've mentioned in the book, I visited at least once. So it was a question of following up. Some collections are better than others in cataloguing things online when you want to fact check something or cross-reference something. Actually, the Royal Collection is very good at cataloguing a lot of their items. Given that many of them aren't on public display, I think they have made quite an extensive effort to catalogue the whole collection. So you can actually look through the Royal Collection online and see photographs of the objects and a date and so on. Might not tell you very much beyond that, but you can see that. So that was very helpful. And then, yeah, so in a sense, a lot of the lockdown process was about actually writing. So maybe, you know, it was good to focus the mind a bit.
Yeah. My experience with lockdown is that a lot of collections kept their staff in employment by getting them to digitize stuff during lockdown. So suddenly the result of lockdown is there's a lot more material that's available you can check.
Yeah, and which is a great thing. So that means, you know, it's much more accessible to people who can't get to those physical sites.
Yeah, and I've been researching in the US and Australia as well as in the UK, because this material is, you know, you can put in a search and find things. So it's extraordinary. you talked about writing a kind of a backbone of the book and then chapter by chapter. So at what stage were you when you started pitching the book to agents, publishers, that kind of thing?
I had an overall arc of the book, and I'd written one chapter. So one of the chapters was sort of, I mean, you know, changed along the way, but one of the chapters was in a good shape, and I had an overall arc and mapped out what the other chapters were going to be. And that largely stayed the same, actually. I mean, you know, there were some objects that sort of came to the fore more than others in a way that I didn't expect, perhaps. But that the sort of arc and of where it was going and the kind of concept and the key object of each chapter was mapped out.
So is that what you pitched as a book? And then, I mean, I presume you had an agent for television work. A book agent is something else. So is that something that you had to go to?
I have a book agent. Yeah, she's excellent, Emma Patterson. Yes, so I had a pitch document which included sort of each chapter's outline and then a full chapter. It was actually the Kew Gardens chapter that was written first.
Okay, interesting. So one of the things that I found really interesting in the way that you pick out the stories is there's lots of stories that have kind of really stuck with me. One of which I thought was quite interesting is when you talk about I'd like you to tell us who the Munchie is in Queen Victoria's story. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting about that is that you said that as a result of that story coming to light, there was then a sort of industry that followed, and there was a movie and a things. I'd never really kind of connected that economic case for bringing these stories out. So could you, for the benefit of those listening, could you tell us who the Munchie is and what that story is?
Oh. So Munchie is an Urdu/Persian word that sort of refers to perhaps teacher. And the teacher in question we're talking about is the person who taught Queen Victoria how to speak Urdu. And the individual in concern was called Abdul Karim. Some of you may have seen the film Victoria and Abdul, which I personally think is not a great film, doesn't actually do justice to the story, even though you've got the amazing Judi Dench in it, which is a shame. But essentially, this is an individual who first comes over to the UK as a servant, an Indian servant to Queen Victoria, and then actually ends up striking a friendship with her. And I think, based on their conversations and her diary and some of the exchanges that we do have, I do think there was a genuine friendship despite the sort of power dynamics there. And he becomes close to her and she expresses an interest in learning Urdu. So he goes from just being a servant who was sort of, stand there with curry at dinner or whatever, to actually being a friend and a confidant, someone she cared about quite.
Are you there?
I think she's frozen. Yes.
Oh, yes. Well,
no problem.
So I will just fill in a bit. So one of the things that's fascinating about this is that Fatima then makes a case in the book, which I've got here, which is talking about Queen Victoria's role as an individual and her attitudes to Indian subjects and to learning the Urdu as a language, and her friendship with the Munchie, as he was called, and contrasting that with Queen Victoria's sort of position as the head of state when as Empress of India, as she was titled, and this kind of what's the word? This kind of conflict between the personal views and her role as head of state, which I found really interesting. And then from that, in 1902, when after Queen Victoria had died and her son Edward VII was about to be crowned king, there were subjects from all over the empire who arrived in Britain to be part of the coronation ceremony. And the Duke of Connaught, who was one of Queen Victoria's younger sons, he too could speak Urdu, and so met contingents of Indian delegates and representatives and spoke their language. And what I found really interesting is a whole kind of section that Fatima wrote, which is basically about this idea of an outgoing Britain wanting to engage with the world, but doing that in the terms of the people that they were meeting, so learning the language and stuff. And I've that's kind of chimed with me, because my grandfather was a soldier in India in the 1930s, and I can remember him speaking Urdu, because he had to learn it as an officer. All the officers had to learn Urdu. They had to pass an exam in Urdu that was examined by an Indian examiner. And if you failed that exam after 3 months in India, you were sent home. And not only that, but he was also encouraged to learn a second Indian language. And I've written this down because I want to make sure I've got it right. But he was sent to the northwest frontier. So he learnt Pashtun or Pashto. And when he was, as an elderly man, he went back in the late 1980s and early 1990s to see where he'd spent his 20s. And he could still remember enough of the language to get around and order food and drinks and things. And I find that I was going to ask Fatima about that kind of attitude, which seems very different from our current attitude, as she sort of spells out in the book about how we learn languages in school and what we're encouraging our students to do. Ezra, have we had any word from Fatima?
I have tried to call her, sent her a message, so hopefully she'll be back soon. But in the meantime, I mean, you've read this book, and what has struck you the most about it? What was it the content, some stories, and what have you learned from it?
I've learned a great deal. It is, I think, the thing that really, I mean, there's lots of great stories, and just you can tell that Fatima's an investigative reporter and a journalist. She's very good
Excellent.
at taking a complex area of research and finding a human story in it. And some of the stories are fantastic. I think that the battle between Victoria and her staff and family about the treatment, the treatment given to the Munshi is really interesting. Okay. And Edward VII seems to have ordered letters to be burnt and records to be burnt. So you get this kind of sense of Victoria is pushing a more tolerant, a more welcoming, a more embracing, maybe a maternal kind of view of Indian subjects. I found that really interesting.
Okay. And have you seen the film that Fatima just mentioned?
Yes, I have.
And what take do you have on this then? The book and the film, was a dichotomy or something similar, or did they follow different storylines?
Yeah, it's. I think the problem is that in casting Judi Dench, they're following in the shadow of Mrs. Brown, the big Oscar-winning, I think it was, movie from the 1990s, and sadly, the Victoria and Abdul just doesn't quite pack the same punch. It's not quite as moving. It's not quite as effective, and I think it's because it's a very different story, but it's kind of in that shadow. So it's yeah, it's you know, it's perfectly well made and it's very well acted.
Thank you, Simon. I think Fatima's it crashed on the other and she's joining us now. So thank you. Excellent. Okay. So you saw the similarities. Let's see if she's here. She's joining us, and it says Katarzyna, but that is Fatima, definitely. There she goes.
Hello again.
Sorry, so sorry. I had this very strange crash. I had no idea what was happening. I thought you were still there and I was still talking.
Well, I thought it was me. I thought it might be my son playing on Minecraft and taking up all the internet, but no.
No, I had a very strange device crash. I'm back. Hopefully it's working. We were talking about the Munshi. Abdul Karim, I think.
Yes. So
essentially he goes from being a servant to a trusted friend of Queen Victoria. He teaches her Urdu, and yeah, as a result, you have this sort of, you know, very unexpected friendship between the British monarch, she's the Empress of India. She presides over sort of the colonial empire, but at the same time, she has a genuine friendship with somebody who's of Indian Muslim background, who influences her in a way that other courtiers found quite disturbing and became concerned about.
I think I was just saying as to everybody else while you were indisposed that you sort of make a distinction between Victoria's private, personal kind of relationship with the Indian subjects and her position as the head of state, which I thought was really interesting, that the kind of tensions between there. But I also noticed that you mentioned the Duke of Connaught, one of her younger sons, could also speak Urdu. And this is, I was saying in the gap that my grandfather, who served in India in the 1930s, had to learn Urdu as a British officer. And if he didn't pass an exam, he'd get sent home. And he could still speak enough of it in the 1980s that he could get by and order things when he went to visit the Northwest frontier. But you make a point in the book about that kind of attitude of if Britain is going to have an outgoing relationship with the rest of the world, that maybe learning the language is the first step. Maybe you could speak a bit more about that and kind of what should we be teaching in schools?
I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because where we are now is language learning in the UK isn't great, you know, regardless of which language. If you compare it to other European countries or other Asian countries, the sort of language learning in school is just not as much of the priority in Britain as it is in other countries. And I think sort of pragmatically, that's a shame. I mean, you know, you can make a case about what language learning does to the brain, does for the individual, but pragmatically, if you're looking at a state that wants to be outward and you know, trade with the world as we're promised after this sort of post-Brexit moment, then you do want people who are able to look outward and engage with people in their own language. I mean, but the thing to remember is that this is always double-edged. So, you know, while I sort of, on the one hand, praise the fact that you have got Queen Victoria, you know, various members of the royal family, other sort of civil servants, British officials, colonial officials who were able to speak multiple languages. You had people who could speak Urdu, Arabic, Persian. You know, in chapter 3, the chapter about Tipu Sultan, there are individuals who are involved in this sort of and categorizing the plunder of having sort of conquered his kingdom and then taken the loot and then categorizing the plunder. There is also an individual who categorizes his books because he can read the languages. He can read many of the scriptures. But that's double-edged. I mean, it's all very well to say, oh, isn't it fantastic they could speak the language? But the reason they could speak the language was because it was about colonizing a part of the world. I don't think we can take away from that. What I'm calling for now is to say, well, is there a way that we can sort of appreciate different parts of the world, including parts of the former empire, many of which now make up the Commonwealth, in a way that is a more sort of, if not equal, but in a more sort of open way, in a way that there's less about Britain being the dominant force and colonizing these other peoples, but in a way that's kind of more appreciative to say, well, yes, there is a past link between Britain and these countries, and many people from those countries and their families and their descendants are here in Britain today, and we could celebrate that heritage without forgetting that we are talking about the brutalities and the very real brutalities of empire at the same time. So it's not, you know, I'm not trying to say let's just put on rose-tinted glasses and all speak Urdu and everything be great. Of course, it's not going to be that way. But it's to say, could we learn to appreciate some links that we have in a different way? And you know, one of the reasons I say that is because I think that, you know, in many ways, whether it's a South Asian language or a West Asian language, they would now be seen as sort of alien to Britain in some ways, or that you must be a foreigner if you speak those languages. But hang on, you know, we have a situation where arguably the best known monarch of Britain could speak Urdu, and not just speak, but write. I mean, you can often see her diaries. They're put on exhibition at places like Kensington Palace or Osborne House. They're not permanently on display, but they're put on as part of special exhibitions, and you can see that she made a great effort to actually learn the scripture. she was still writing about the weather, which was very British, I suppose. But I think that that's fascinating in itself. But, you know, aside of that, the other character who doesn't make a huge appearance in the book, but I certainly mentioned him in the introduction, was Enoch Powell, who's sort of known for very different reasons now in the UK. But by the way, he could also fluently speak Urdu. Yeah.
I think what's really got me thinking about it is there's a, you know, the nuance of all of this, that I think one of the things you say early on is that it makes the past richer and more complicated. But I in what you were saying about the kind of I guess the word is ideology. There's a passage from page 186 that I thought was particularly timely for the news this week. You say that you're talking about the idea of Indian people living in Britain and this idea of, are they loyal and are they devoted to the monarch? And you say, but indoctrination, loyalty and devotion are the demands of ideological republics like France or the United States, not a post-imperial monarchy like the UK. And then a sentence that I've underlined: non-ideological states cannot demand loyalty. There is no single belief to be loyal to, and we should resist attempts to turn Britain into an insular ideological state that demands loyalty to one narrow set of beliefs. And I thought, oh, that's the headlines this week. So I kind of thought there was a crossover between talking about the West, but also a kind of ideological narrative generally in Britain about who we are. And my thought is that in the days of empire, there was quite a lot of confidence in the idea of Britain going out into the world, and maybe that what we're dealing with is a lack of confidence now. Where would you stand on that?
I think that's a fair categorization in some regards. I think whether it's lack of confidence or confusion about what Britain's role might be in that sort of post-colonial moment. But I mean, you know, one of the reasons I wrote the book and wanted to share these stories is I think it provides us with alternative narratives to mine. So the fact that Queen Elizabeth I exchanges correspondence with the Ottoman Empire, and this is obviously before the creation of Britain, before any empire itself. At that point, the Ottoman Empire is the superpower, and England is the sort of parochial place that is trying to curry favour with these superpowers. But the fact that they exchange letters actually provides us with an alternative history to mine about Britain and who we are. And at the same time, we talked about Queen Victoria and her love of Urdu and her friend. So in a way, if we are trying to reconstruct a narrative of what Britain is, and I think Britain is that can be one of the great things about it, in that we pledge allegiance to the flag in schools every morning in a very sort of narrow way, in that we can have different interpretations of what it means to be British. We can be comfortable or uncomfortable with certain aspects of our history, but that we can have a kind of more open dialogue and say, yes, there are some very terrible things that happened in the past to do with the British Empire that still inform policy and the way people feel today, both in Britain and beyond. But there are also some really interesting history, some rich narratives of a time when Britain and England before it looked towards South Asia, whether that was, and really appreciated those influences. Or Stuarts after them, really seeking to emulate parts of the Ottoman Empire, or the Georgians after them. There's a sort of interchange and a fluidity that I think doesn't recognise. And I think all of that is in the fabric of Britain. It's sort of hidden away, but it's something that we need to talk more about.
It's interesting. It's interesting. The other thing I was thinking of as I was reading the book is that there's been a sort of response to the National Trust, that has also investigated some of its history in this kind of way, and so I wondered whether you kind of following that debate, or those discussions? And was there a concern about this being a contentious subject as you were writing it? I mean, in your position as a newsreader, you know, again, this week, the impartiality and what a newsreader or a presenter is able to say. I wondered how much that these fed into what you were writing.
Mm. Well, I mean, we were talking about lockdown. I mean, the other thing that happened in 2020 was an explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement after the death of George Floyd. And, you know, at the time I was constructing and writing the book, having done the research and having had certain things in mind. And suddenly we were seeing the sort of tearing down of the statue of Edward Colston. And for me, that was an interesting moment, because I thought, well, you know, we've got these sort of really polarized debates about pulling down statues. Should we pull down statues? Is it sort of tearing your history to do that? And for me, I thought, well, what we need is kind of more nuanced conversation, because actually you end up a really polarizing debate where people either insist that you are king our history by demanding that objects are returned or statues are pulled down, or you have people who, and I think there's a legitimate argument to say that have been ignored, that those conversations about race and about the history of empire haven't been able to take place in a meaningful way, and therefore some people have resorted to extremes to sort of highlight what's happening. And I mean, you know, around the issue of the Edward Colston statue, I think it's worth noting that there had been extensive debates and discussions around what to do when people had rejected the idea of simply installing a plaque, furnishing people with a bit more detail. So that sort of pulling down of a statue doesn't happen in isolation. That's something to remember. I mean, you will note that I don't take a sort of definitive position on, you know, should certain objects be returned or not. You know, I don't think that's necessarily my place to do so. But I think that I am politically impartial. You know, in the book, I say both Conservative and Labour governments have failed us in terms of telling this history. So there's no political party that can say, actually, you know, we have done right on this in terms of furnishing the history or being able to construct a political narrative that's in that sense. I think my role is to be politically impartial, but I think you can still have open discussions about these issues. And you know, when I've been meeting readers around the country at various book events, it's been interesting, because I think there are people of different political backgrounds. You know, there may be people who are more small c conservative, or people who are more small c liberal, who actually find that there is something in the book that they can agree with, because it is simultaneously about saying, let's appreciate the history, let's get more people into stately homes, let's think about preserving history, but also being critical of it at the same time. And as for the National Trust debate, yeah, I mean, I have followed that, and that's obviously happened more recently. Again, I think there's been sort of more heat than light a lot of the time, and especially the coverage of it has been very sort of ferocious. When you look at what's actually vocal minority, and that's quite interesting. And I think that I'm going to do sometime quite as simple as updating this, necessarily talking about something is running, they may well be talking about altering the sign, and I think we can't alter a sign without a massively heated debate, and then we're in a bit of a problem, really, and we need to be able to talk better.
Okay. I think we may have missed a little bit of your answer there, but I think I got the gist. You're saying that the changing of the signs is the contentious issue.
Oh, sorry, did I cut out? Because you're not hearing me?
Just a little bit. I just lost bits of your.
I was just saying that actually, sometimes what we're talking about is something as simple as altering a sign or adding more information, and that shouldn't be as contentious. I can understand that you might have a very vociferous debate about returning an object, and that's right, that you should have a vociferous debate. But you know, I think we need to look at the details of what we're actually talking about here. A lot of the time, it's simply about updating information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. So you talked about that people have had. I've just been prompted to remind people to submit their questions into the chat if they'd like to ask questions, and we'll come to those shortly. But you talked about your the responses you've had from people who've read the book and when you've been doing events. What kind of responses have you had from the book? And the thing in the introduction you say is that you want to hear more of these stories, and it's the start of a journey. So as well as responses, what have you learned since the book was published?
Well, there's people who come up to me at events and say, have you heard of X, or have you been to what? Which is great, because that was really what I wanted. Is this is not a definitive collection of objects. These are just things that caught my eye and that I needed to be shared with people. But actually, there are many more objects out there that people find interesting or that are lesser known. And so those are the sort of brilliant responses when people come and tell me something that I hadn't quite heard. An additional object to one of those that I write about. I've also had people who either volunteer in sites or have in some way worked in the sort of arts or history industry who say that they would like to or education would like to continue that conversation, and would like sort of to talk about how some of the things I mentioned could translate or an art gallery. And so those have been really fantastic and positive. And that's really what I wanted, was to start that conversation and for people to take that away and do something.
Excellent. So we've just been asked on the chat, what is the movie? So the Munshi movie is Victoria and Abdul with Judi Dench in it, and I think it's fairly readily available. I'd have to check which streamers it's available on. It may even be available on DVD if you remember those. Speaking of heritage, so where are you going to go next with this, or with anything else? What are you working on at the moment, Fatima?
Well, I have got a list of things that other objects or places I've left along the way, but I don't necessarily think that the follow-up to this book may. That point, because people have told me interesting things. There's always going to be more to say, but I will see. The last one took me 5 years.
Oh, I think we've lost you again.
But if I with a friend or family member, they just irritated because I'm always searching out for other things and thing that doesn't quite belong still. So the detective side of me remains.
What struck me is it's detective, but also there's a journalistic thing of bringing out the personal stories that people that what this book is a kind of a collection of stories about people that really brings them to life. Is that a journalistic attitude to history? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, possibly. One of the things that I was thinking about a lot was that I wanted these stories to be really accessible, so that people who don't necessarily know much about the history of a particular era in Britain can pick it up and find interesting. It's not to say that some of these stories have never been written about. There are academics who spend a long time researching a particular era and might mention some of these objects as part of that. So and I rest on the shoulders of those historians. But it's about presenting it in a way that is accessible. Just read one chapter at a time and feel that you gain something from it, as well as the overall arc. And I wanted it to be very accessible in that way, because that's part of the rewriting it, is to get people into those sites and get them asking more critical questions. But and I also just think that paintings and so on are only as interesting as the stories behind them, the people behind them, and that's ultimately what connects us to. It's all very well, here is this painting, or here is this object. It might be nice to look at, but ultimately it's the sort of the people around them and behind them that really, I think, a different way. And I think that for me particularly, sort of emotionally quite strong in the last chapter, which is about the First World War and Indian soldiers came to Britain, particularly in Brighton and the South Coast, to sort of recuperate in the hospitals after having been in the trenches. You know, looking at their letters, looking at their diaries and looking at objects that they left behind. That for me, that felt very sort of emotional, to think about the sort of lives they've led. Those objects that they've left behind, pieces that they've left behind, might tell us about what was happening in that particular era.
Yes, you one of the stories that you tell that's really stuck in my head is the brothers in the First World War, Mir Dast and Mir Mast, one of whom is in Brighton and is awarded the Victoria Cross for bravery, and the other one is fighting for Germany and is awarded the Iron Cross. There's a movie right there. I mean, that's just,
yeah,
you know,
yeah, absolutely. And that's the other thing, is that, you know, sort of, it's a wealth of stories that tell us something about Britain, that different people in Britain can connect to, and we'd love to hear more of them. I mean, I did an event last year, and somebody said to me, you know, why can't we have a sort of Bridgerton story of Queen Elizabeth I and her Moroccan ambassadors? And I thought, yeah, why can't we? I mean, maybe not as sort of raunchy as Bridgerton, but you know, why can't we have things like that are more accessible, that people who wouldn't necessarily pick up a history book might find interesting and learn something new from?
Yeah, I'm quite taken by you interviewed my friend Vinay Patel for this book about his Doctor Who episode, and I was in an event a couple of weeks ago where the then executive producer of Doctor Who was saying that they wanted to do a story about partition because kids in Britain don't get taught about it. And I thought that was really, again, we were talking about the sort of economic end of this research. There's things that you can do with these stories. So that's that again feels like it's a benefit to everybody, that we get a dramatic and exciting story out of this. And
I think that's important, because when we talk about these stories, I think so often, particularly in the sort of corporate world, there's all this sort of chat about diversity and diversity initiatives. But for me, that's not the right approach. You know, let's get together a bunch of people and look like a Bennett and Nad, or we're doing this as a kind of favour to minorities in Britain. That's not the attitude that I think we should be looking at. We should be looking at the fact that these are stories that exist in British history. Some people may be more interested in them because of their personal, family, cultural, religious connection, sure, but they're actually really great stories in themselves that we all might find interesting, whether that's in a stately home or turned into a film or a piece of television. So why not look at that instead of just repeating the same old stories every time? You know, there's just a wealth of history out there that we can mine.
Yeah, I wondered whether, you know, part of the thing, because I work in the world of Doctor Who, but I've been looking at crime fiction recently for something else, and there's the sort of constant cry is that what writers of detective fiction want to do is write something new, but what readers of detective fiction want is to read the same things again. And I wonder if actually telling new stories about history is facing some of the same concerns. And it's a genre issue rather than a sort of identity issue, maybe.
Yeah, and you know, look, let's be real. There are always going to be commercial factors in all of this, but my argument is that if you don't like the moral case, I think there is certainly a commercial case for all of this.
Yeah. Interesting. Right. Well, I said I would turn this over to questions from the audience. I don't think we've had any questions yet. Lots of people telling us where you can see Victoria and Abdul. It's apparently on Netflix.
I don't even remember it as a film.
Simon, I've got a couple of questions if there's none at the moment.
Oh, yes, please.
Yes, obviously I've come across Fatima through Channel 4, and this is International Women Week, and she's a fantastic role model. So my question is this, bearing in mind the Women Week, I mean, what have been, for you as a Muslim woman in your role in the world of media, the celebrations part and the challenges?
I think it's interesting because you know, when I first started my career as a journalist, I was very keen not to be boxed in as a Muslim woman or an anything woman, frankly. I just wanted to be a journalist who does interesting stories, and for the longest time, I didn't write or broadcast anything that was sort of about Muslims per se, because I didn't want to be boxed in. I knew that was a challenge. I mean, some of you may be familiar with sort of more difficult episodes I've had with the Sun newspaper, for instance. I don't want to go into that, but, you know, sort of being attacked for being a presenter on a story about terrorism was the gist of it. So that's the sort of more difficult part. I guess the celebration is that it's nice now to be able to go to schools or sort of meet younger people coming through the ranks who more presence on the media landscape makes them feel that they can do it too, which is great. So that's the celebration of it. But you know, I would say to anyone who's sort of aspiring to be a journalist or a writer is to not allow you to be boxed in by anything, whether that's your religion or your culture. You know, why should some people be known as writers and journalists, people as women writers or Muslim writers? We don't need to draw parts of our heritage and our culture in our interests, but all of us do that. So let's recognize writers as writers and as journalists, and acknowledge that they have different facets, parts to them, but not box people in.
No, I totally agree with you, Fatima. Absolutely. I'm a writer myself, and yes, I'm Muslim, I'm a woman, but my first role is of a writer. Now, my second question relates to, again, the Women's Week. What does embrace equity mean for you? What's your take on that, this year's theme for the International Women's Day? I think Fatima's frozen again. You're frozen on the screen, Fatima.
Am I frozen? You can't hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Okay, that's fine.
Good. Sorry, I don't know why this freezing thing's happening. I mean, it looks fine my end. I'm sorry. You were I mean, look, for me, I just think that if we talk about equity and justice, then some of that will be about thinking about our history and how we ended up here today, whether that's in thinking about Britain or thinking about gender equality, etc. But it's also about sort of getting to a place where, again, going back to the sort of previous thought, is we don't sort of decide things based on stereotypes of people. We allow everyone to flourish, to be the sort of very best they can be, whether that's in their career or in life in general. I think that would be my sort of broadest interpretation of it.
No, thank you so much. Now, there is a question in the chat, Simon, I can see.
Yes, there is.
Yeah, do you want to read it out? Yeah.
Yes, so this is a question that's just come in. Fatima's book sounds so interesting, which it is. I recommend it to everybody. But how can the younger generations learn more about global history?
Well, I think part of that lies in a sort of question of school curriculums and what history we're taught. So, you know, one of my bugbears is that so much of this history is British history. It's, you know, it's factual, it happened, and yet even people who've been at school more recently have also told me that they're not taught this either. They'll be taught an awful lot about Tudors and Elizabeth I, but it never once comes up that she had links with the Ottoman Empire, and I find that astonishing, really. You know, and it's not to say let's have a radical change in the curriculum. It's simply saying that if you're teaching something like Elizabeth I, then why not tell a broader story of what was happening at the time? So I think some of that has to be about what's being taught in schools. The second part of that is getting families, younger people into these museums and galleries and stately homes and spaces, being able to see some of the objects for themselves, and hopefully that will spark interest. And that this is where the sort of role of sort of cultural institutions is really important. And the third one is something we were talking about earlier, is actually having cultural production and the Doctor Who episode that Vinay Patel, that was based around the story of partition of India and Pakistan. Is a fantastic example of that, because it was compelling as far as I remember at the time. Doctor Who fans absolutely loved it in terms of the drama. It also told you something that you don't necessarily know as a younger viewer, and is important for you to know. An episode in British history, British Empire history, that affects many people of India in the, but also obviously globally. So I think there's sort of three aspects to that, I would say.
I thought, just to come in on that, the episode Demons of the Punjab, which was broadcast in 2018, also does a thing, because it's about a woman from Sheffield who goes back in time to see her grandmother's story from partition, and it's a story her grandmother hasn't told her. And it's that idea of that we kind of think of history as the things that people are told or that they've left records of, but actually, especially in refugee kind of stories, things are not spoken of. They might be too harrowing, or they might be secret and things. And that led to Vinay not only tweeted a reading list for people who were more interested in that history, which I can't. I've been a Doctor Who fan for a long time, and I can't remember an episode coming with a reading list before. Yeah. But also led to a conversation that I had with some members of my family about refugee stories and the bits of history that we don't know, because my ancestors were Huguenots and they were a generation of refugees, and the records just stop at one point. So it opens up all kinds of conversations, I found. I'm just going to check the I'm just going through the comments we've had. We've had lots of very positive comments, but and lots of nice things about how well you are speaking, which is good. I'm not sure there are any questions in there. Do you think that broadcasters have you do address this in the book, that broadcasters have a responsibility to diversity, and all seem quite keen to push their credentials in this area, but what are they not doing, and what should they be doing?
Look, I personally diversity, and I've said this publicly before in a lecture I was asked to give for the National Union of Journalists. For me, diversity is a sort of corporate answer to something. So you have lots of different organisations, and many of them mean well. They might say, well, we want to represent Britain better, or we want to think more carefully about different voices and different people coming into the organisation. But then you get into sort of silly territory sometimes, where you end up sort of counting people and not thinking about what they actually have to offer, but counting them based on their race or their gender or their class, which none of us really want. None of us want to be judged by our racial background, or the fact we're a man or a woman. So I think that, rather than talking about diversity, we need to talk about difference and a range of stories. So for me, it's about thinking about, if we're talking about a news organisation, for instance, it's about thinking, how do you get the broadest range of journalism in our newsroom? And some of that is going to be thinking about getting people from different backgrounds together, but it's not sort of boxing them in, not a sort of tick box exercise where you say, right, we have X number of Black presenters now, or X number of women. And it's also shouldn't be done in a superficial way. I think it's sometimes, particularly when we're talking about visual mediums, it's very easy to say, well, look how diverse X organisation is because of the face of who is sort of presenting. But actually, people making the decisions are behind closed doors, and they're sort of off-screen diversity, to me, is just as, if not more important, and something that we should be thinking much more carefully about, because in the end, those are people who make decisions and shape the output. Whether that's in documentaries or news or dramas, etc. And I think that there's a lot more work to be done there.
And what about the museums and galleries that you've been visiting? I'm aware that stories are opening up a bit as I go and visit places, especially, somewhere I've been to 5 years ago. You suddenly find that there's more interpretation. There's in some cases they'll have 2 or 3 different interpretations of the same piece by different audiences. But what are you seeing, and what would you like to see happening?
I think one of the problems with the sort of stately home gallery experience is a lot of it rests on volunteers, and perhaps only a certain profile of person can afford to volunteer or is interested enough to volunteer in some of those places. So we need a sort of broader range of people getting involved there. And I think that's really where partly the book is a sort of call to action to say, well, let's get a broader range of people into some of these spaces. You know, we all have different interests and we'll pick out different things about certain objects and have interpretations of them. So the broader range of people would really help with that. I think since I wrote the book, certainly some sites, and I've had sort of readers contact me about certain sites and say, oh, by the way, you know, I've been to Powers Castle and I've noticed that they've put up an additional sign or they've done X. So I think there are really kind of well-meaning efforts. People are quietly carrying on aside of the sort of heated debates, and just in terms of thinking more carefully about signage or including further detail or recognizing that something may have a darker history than has been otherwise presented. But there's a lot more work to be done, and I think that it needs to be done in a sophisticated, not a sort of with a sledgehammer. You know, it needs to be done in a thoughtful, considered way. And I think there's a long way to go for many of the museums and galleries and stately homes that I visited, certainly.
Excellent.
Simon, there is a question there. If you want to read it, or shall I read it? It's in the chat.
Yes, I've just got that. I've actually got one in the Q&A and one in the chat to keep me on my toes.
Oh, excellent.
So the one in the Q&A is, Fatima, you touched upon tokenization and the idea of hiring to make workplaces more diverse. I wonder what the outcome of this is. Is there any value at all to having black and brown faces in the same positions if the structures of power don't change? What does representation meaningfully achieve?
Yeah, I think that, well, I mean, you've kind of answered the question there. You know, we don't just want different colours of the same thing. It makes no sense. The whole point of whether you want to call it diversity or difference or representation is to say, well, here are some different voices. Here is a different way of thinking about things. And so if you have people who sort of have different skin colours, but everyone has a similar perspective, but that's political or cultural or social, then that sort of defeats the object for me, which is why I think it's really important not to get into a kind of superficial tick box exercise, which I think sometimes, and not just broadcasters, I think other organizations have also been guilty of this. And then you also end up with a situation where people might feel, you know, X only got their job because they're a woman, or they only got that opportunity because they're black or brown. We don't want that either. So yeah, absolutely. I think it's about thinking about the structures of organizations and thinking more carefully about the difference of voices and opinions that you have in a place, as much, or if not more so, than about thinking about the racial gender composition of a place.
Excellent. The question in the chat is, what is the most important thing that makes you a strong woman, and who shapes your personality?
Oh God, that's a really difficult question. I don't know. I don't know who shapes my personality. I guess we're all subject to lots of different influences. You know, partly it's something I said earlier. It's this a refusal to be boxed in, that you can be sort of proud of your identity and your values and your influences, but to not allow yourself to just be one thing. And I think that's quite important, you know, whoever you are, and to sort of have a slight audaciousness to say, well, I can do this. I mean, you know, sometimes, you know, this very idea of writing about history or art or culture, people might imagine that only some people can do that, but I think that actually, with the right research, it's, you know, if you put the work in, it's possible for a broader range of us to do that. So yeah, I think it's having a certain level of audaciousness, I guess.
Does that mean you've had a response from people working in history, sort of professional historians, to what you've written?
I've had really positive responses from professional historians, because actually they feel that it's a way of bringing people into their field who wouldn't otherwise look at it. So, you know, personally, the sort of academics and historians, and I've spoken at various universities, think it's a positive thing, because it's a way of drawing people in, where they might not read a sort of a more academic text. But I think that, you know, culturally we do have an idea of what a historian looks like. or an art critic looks like. And that's something that we perhaps need to break down.
Okay.
I've got
Yes,
a
please.
question. So yes, Fatima, thank you so much. That's been absolutely amazing afternoon. You've been brilliant. So my question relates to your writing life, really. First, aspiring writers, what sort of tips would you give them, advice to aspiring writers? Secondly, share with us your any writing routine. Obviously, you've got a full-time job in the world of media, but so when do you do it? Monthly, in the morning, afternoon, or whatever? You share with us.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be really interested to hear Simon's tips too. One of my biggest things is, it sounds really simple, but go for a walk. Because every time I'd sort of reach a stumbling block with writing, or a particular section, I'd be trying to work out how to connect two ideas together. I would find that just stepping away and going for a walk in the fresh air with nothing on, no music, no audiobooks, not talking to anyone, just walking. Somehow by the end of that walk, I would find that the words had come together in my head. And I think, and I've read some interesting sort of neurological studies about the act of walking, what impact that can have to your brain. And I think that for me, it's a really simple thing, but it's worked every time. Whenever I've been stuck on a passage or not quite worked out how to construct a sentence or a paragraph, if I step away and go for a walk, it really, really helps. And I find it sort of the solution presents itself a lot of the time. And then my other thing is organization, particularly when you're not doing it full time. So, I would only be able to sort of work on the book on my days off from Channel 4 News. And that meant that I had to be really organized, because sometimes it might be, I don't know, a week or 10 days between going back to something. So, each chapter had a kind of notebook file of its own. And I'm one of these people who hasn't grown out of sort of my different colored pens and Post-its to categorize things. So I would excessively categorize everything, so that if I had not picked it up for a little while, it would be easy enough to dip back into it and find the bit that I was looking for. And I also think that sometimes handwriting things can help. So while I didn't handwrite the book at all, but as much as I'd be taking notes on my computer or photographing things, I would often make handwritten notes about some specific things that I really wanted to emphasize, or feelings or thoughts that I had when I walked into a place. And I think those were very helpful to me. So those are just some things I've personally found useful. But I'd be really interested to hear Simon's tips.
Well, I think just that you can't get around, and I've been a freelance writer for more than 20 years, and you can't get around the fact that you have to do the writing, and you just have to actually do it, and it's boring and frustrating. But there are ways to make that easier. So short bursts are good, and usually with a reward, maybe a cup of tea, I find is quite good. But also just getting a bit done every day. I think a big danger is that you can kind of go, oh, I haven't got the whole day, or, I'm going to write 5,000 words today or whatever. Actually, just getting a bit done, even a paragraph, you're kind of chipping away at things. And what Fatima was saying about going for a walk, what that then does is that while you're not doing the writing, you're kind of still working on it, because you know what you're going to do next. So the next time you sit down, you know what the next sentence is going to be, or how to fix the bit that you were stuck on. So if you're kind of on it constantly, your brain is always working it out, even if you're not actually typing. And I find that very useful. I totally agree on handwriting stuff. So I have a notebook. I have piles and piles of notebooks that anytime I think of anything, I scribble it down. And that also means that I stop churning that idea in my head. And I can move on to something else. But yeah, if anybody has any solutions to how to write something without actually having to do the boring typing, I would be very grateful to hear them. We've had another question. Could we usefully have a TV series like Back in Time for Birmingham? It's just been on BBC Two, about the history of a Hindu family's arrival here year by year. and why not one from the Muslim perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose those are quite broad categories in themselves. So, sort of Hindu families, I guess, come from lots of different parts of the world, not just India, and similarly Muslims, even more parts of the world. So they're very broad categories. But yeah, absolutely. Why not? It'd be interesting to watch. I'd watch it.
When you were saying that you were kind of thinking about documentaries or things related to this research, what kind of response do you get from commissioning editors and producers? I'm not sure how much you can say. Is there is this seen as a niche subject?
I can't say too much specifically at the moment. I think that's there are some people who are more interested than others. For me, one of the great things has been actually seeing the book not just seeing the book in bookshops, but seeing it categorized as British history, because my fear was that it would end up sort of seen as like, oh, South Asian or West Asian history, but actually it's British history. And so when I've walked into a bookshop and just seen a section of British history and it's just there, that's been very nice to see, because it's a mainstream British history book.
Yeah. Sorry, I saw a question and then it vanished, so I think somebody's changed their mind. And with that in mind, did you have an idea of where your book would be placed in bookshop? Did you kind of that's where it's going to sit in a bookshop? Did you have that kind of in mind when you were writing?
Well, so it's interesting. We were talking about sort of publishing earlier. We talked to lots of different people. I remember one person said, "Well, we're not sure if it's a book about history or art or politics," which I thought was interesting. That you would want something so definitively in one category, because actually it's a mix of all of those. No, I didn't have a specific idea, but I was very pleased to see it sort of placed as a British history book, because I think ultimately that is, if we're to categorize it as anything, that is what it is. Obviously it touches on other genres. No, I didn't necessarily. I mean, to be honest, for a long time, and I'm sure you'll recognize this, you get to the point where you can't quite imagine it as a book, and you think, does anyone even want to read this? Sort of when you're lost in your own rabbit hole. So actually I was very glad to see it in a bookshop at all.
And is it available to buy in the gift shops of the places you talk about?
Yeah, and I've seen it in some of those places, which is great, and it's nice when I've sort of accidentally bumped into it, so that's fantastic.
Yeah, excellent. Kesra, I think we may have exhausted the questions from the audience. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, basically to thank everyone. I think Fatima's had a lot of time, mashallah, nearly 18 minutes, and she's been talking non-stop, and she's been brilliant at it. My goodness, mashallah.
Well, thank you, and I'm sorry for disappearing in between. My computer's having a crash.
Yeah, that was a funny side. I'm glad we had that conversation earlier, but you kept coming back, so it's great. So I want to thank you, first of all, Fatima. It's been a real honor and a privilege to host you, and we had a brilliant time together, and we learned a lot, and a lot of positive comments have come through. And thank you for joining us. And then thank you to Simon for doing a brilliant job with all those wonderful questions. Keep it going, and etc. You were brilliant at it. And thank you for being with us as well, Simon, away from your children. And Sam from the University of Salford. Thank you, Sam, so much for supporting MACFEST, supporting this event, and being there also on your Saturday. And of course, thank my own team behind the scene, Katarzyna, Steve, and everybody else. So Steve, if you don't mind putting the slide on, please. So of course, finally, a real big thank you also to all our attendees, friends, family, people we don't know, people from Indonesia, for example, Bung from Indonesia, from Germany, from Afghanistan, who've joined us as well on a Saturday. So just a reminder, tomorrow we have another amazing panel, Afghani women artists, freedom of expression through art. Imagine what their situation is like. They're artists, they want to paint, they want to express their creativity, but what is it like under the life of the Taliban. So find out more from there. And our host is Angelica, who's also joined us today. She will be hosting, and our chief guest is coming all the way from New York, Chris Sakrabani. It's bound to be a brilliant panel just like this one. So tomorrow, 2 o'clock, inshallah, we'll see you. So good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And thank you so much, Fatima, again.